Hidden in the depths of the mind is a secret tomb where knowledge, fear, mystery, and a macabre sense of enjoyment is held. Each corner is resplendent with its own curiosities, and each curiosity appeals to a different soul. You're listening to The Crypt of the Unknown, a podcast that discusses the realms of the horrific and the fantastic in print, games, or on the screen. And now, introducing you to the Guardians of the Crypt, your tour guides. Here are Webb and Stephen J.D. Welcome, weary travelers, to The Crypt of the Unknown, a podcast that discusses the horrific and fantastic across all forms of media. I am the Critical Android, and joining me for this episode, it's not my regular co-host, we have a special guest, author Meg Hafdahl.
Hi!
How you doing, Meg?
Good. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And in full disclosure, I want to note that if the name sounds familiar, it's because I reviewed one of Meg's books, which she sent me a digital copy of, back around September of 2020, which was The Science of Stephen King that you wrote with your partner in crime, Kelly.
That's right. Yep. That was our third book that we've written together.
Yes, and you've also written, you and Kelly Florence, The Science of Women in Horror.
And The Science of Monsters.
And there's more to come, because there's a lot that we have to discuss, because you've been writing up a storm lately, not just with the science, but you also have your own fictional series that you write as well.
Yeah, I have a novel series, I have a short story series, I have several stories and anthologies, so I kind of like to get my hands into everything, I guess.
Apparently you do, and I want to discuss all of them, but before we do, let's dive into what really brings you to the horror genre. What is your first memory of ingesting some sort of horror-related media?
Wow, that's a good question. I think that my first sort of, and I know this doesn't really count as horror necessarily, but my mom loved to watch Murder, She Wrote and Matlock.
Well, true crime counts, even though it's not quite true crime.
Yeah,
but
and I remember when I was 5, I started to become interested in the idea of the perfect murder. And I remember I freaked my mom out because I was like watching Matlock with her and I was like, how can someone actually get away with murder? And she said like, oh, I don't know if I should let you watch Matlock anymore with me. From then on, like anything remotely, dark or devious, I wanted to watch. My mom very much liked, the non-supernatural horror, and my dad very much liked the very supernatural stuff. So I kind of, just by watching with them and then pretty soon then I was with my Blockbuster card renting my own. So I guess that's kind of where it grew from.
Did you at any point in time, were you ever scared by the movies you were watching, or were you so accustomed to them that you just enjoyed them without the feel of fear?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I think that I remember like really moments in movies that really stuck with me. Like for instance, one of my favorites that I would rent when I was about 8 or so was Dawn of the Dead. There's 2 scenes in that movie that really upset me. The one where the zombie gets the top of his head cut off by the helicopter, like that really just kind of like, whoa, scared me. Mm-hmm. And then also the blood in that movie is so like Technicolor vibrant. And for some reason that really stuck in my mind. So I would have these moments where I'm like, oh, but I love the feeling of being scared. So I don't know. I guess it's counterintuitive for some people, but I think people who love horror understand that I wanted that feeling more and more. That's what I was always like kind of pursuing.
Now, I know that like one woman can't speak to the entire experience of women in general, but in my experience, it seems like despite the fact that in horror there is a predilection to put women as victims, I know more women who are into horror, whether it be supernatural type horror or true crime stories, but I feel like more women than men tend to gravitate towards the horror genre, at least from what my experience is. And I'm wondering if you have a perspective on why that would be, especially when there still seems to be the, I don't want to say a stereotype, but I guess the overuse of women being used as victims in this type of in this genre?
Well, this is a really sort of big encompassing idea, and we definitely talk about it in the science of women in horror. But it's true, women love horror. And I think as consumers of horror, as well as like someone like myself who writes it and works within it for a living, females have this unique concept or ability to tap into horror that I think men don't necessarily always have the ability. And that's because from the moment that we're really conscious of who we are, we're told that we're victims. I'm 5 foot tall, so a lot of women, feel vulnerable. Like that's just how they navigate through the world. So there's something very cathartic and very empowering about watching, a final girl, for example, who maybe sometimes uses her physical prowess like a Ripley, but maybe also uses like her cleverness or, her ability to, I love a final girl who, uses her smarts. So I think that there's something, again, really empowering in that. And there's also stories to be told within the sort of female space, whether it be about gaslighting or whether it be about abuse or whatever, that horror for some reason really seems to resonate other than other genres. And that's why, Mary Shelley and Charlotte Perkins Gilman and all these wonderful women who came before us, they were able to sort of take that domestic life of being a woman and turn it into horror. And I think, there are slashers with the male gaze, and there are a lot of movies where, the women are sexualized, again, through male gaze, not through, their own empowerment. And those are kind of annoying. And sometimes people are like, well, how can you be a feminist and love horror? But horror is such a huge landscape of people and places that I think that's a very narrow, there are some people who just make bad movies and all that. And you know what? I enjoy some of those too. So that's a hard question to answer because there's so many elements to it. But I think that there are many reasons why women love horror.
It's fascinating to me what draws people into it because, as you pointed out, there are still elements of the horror community and the making of films that do rely on maybe the sexual exploitation of a female character instead of an empowering kind of sexuality, which,
right,
depending on who's doing the writing, the filming, it can be a very thin line, but often it's crossed without the input of women in that genre, where that can really change things about how characters are portrayed. When it comes to the writing element of things, what brought you into writing in general? Did it start with horror, or did you just enjoy writing in general before you gravitated towards this?
So I loved to read when I was a kid. That was like my number one thing that I loved. And it's funny because, and of course I read, horror books, but as I got older and I knew I wanted to be a writer, that was just always something that I was naturally pretty good at, and I also just loved to do, and I wanted to be better. But I went to college and studied literature, and I thought I wanted to write the next great American novel. I wanted to write literary fiction. I was struggling with it. I just couldn't quite get it. And it's funny to think now because horror is such a big part of my life, but I didn't really connect the two because I think, again, there is a stigma, and I felt like, well, if I'm writing horror, am I really writing what I want to write? And I realized that the horror that I love to read, the horror that I could make, was both of those things, was something that was scary and fun, also underlying meaning to what I was doing. So it took me a while actually to sort of, it seems like duh now, but it took me a while to be like, oh yeah, I love horror, I love writing. And so I put them together. And ever since I did that, I have been successful because I think that was what I was supposed to be doing.
If you watched something or read something where afterwards you thought to yourself, my God, I wish I could create something like that, what works left that impression on you?
Certainly when I was younger, Stephen King, because I loved his ability to not only be scary, but I love his characters and I love his ability to point out the absurdity of life. I kind of have that same kind of sense of humor, and he has these absurd characters and these absurd things that happen, yet he rolls them in quite well to, the action and things that are happening. And there's just an element of kind of understanding the human condition in those books that I love. As I've gotten older, I would say that Shirley Jackson has become a really important influence on me. And like the other day I like sat down, I was like looking at my blank screen and I was like, okay, just be Shirley Jackson right now, which was really big pressure and it didn't happen. But I really love her nuanced and subtle way of writing, which I haven't quite figured out how to do yet, but I very much want to be her when I grow up.
Well, when it comes to the fiction that you've written so far, where did things start from? Like, what was the first, because I know you've got the Willoughby Chronicles. What was the starting point for your adventure into writing fictional horror?
Well, I decided, okay, I'm really going to, take this seriously. And I had kind of two things that happened. There was this Jane Austen, which I know this is coming down to horror, but there was this Jane Austen contest from like her, I don't know, museum or something in England. And it said, take characters from one of her stories and turn it into whatever kind of like fiction you want. And so I did. I wrote a story and I sent it in. And at that time, it wasn't even that long ago, but you had to send it in like through snail mail. I didn't win it, but I got, pretty high up on the list. And that was a really good feeling because that was kind of, for at least for a while, that was kind of my first acknowledgement, like, oh, maybe I can write. And then the other thing that happened is I wrote a short story, and it was the first short story in a long time that I actually submitted, and it was called Willoughby. I sat down and I just said, because I had been trying to be a novelist at that point, and I thought, you know what, I'm gonna try short stories again because that's a good way to start. And I wrote Willoughby, and I'm lucky to say that I got it published in an anthology, and then it sort of snowballed because then that publisher told me about another anthology and I wrote another short story, and then I started writing short story collections for the first publisher, and then just got out of control. And I wrote the Willoughby Chronicles novels based in the same world that that first short story took place, which was really fun, actually.
And what about Twisted Reveries? Tell me about Twisted Reveries.
Yes, it is a short story collection. The first one is all just contemporary, different stories. They're all, there's no connection between them. They're all just different worlds. And Willoughby is in that one. And then the second short story collection I did it sort of in preparation for the novels. It's a short story series that all takes place in the small little weird town of Willoughby, Minnesota. And so I kind of jump around in history in that one. And now the third one that's coming out in October, I'm working on right now. And that one kind of goes back to the framework of the first, where it's 13 stories. They all don't relate to each other, but I kept the sort of historical part of it. So they all take place kind of pre-World War II. I kind of enjoy writing horror stories and kind of a historical backdrop. I always write, female-driven stories. I kind of compare them to Twilight Zone. I'm a big Twilight Zone fan. Some of them kind of have those feelings and gothic feelings and stuff. I don't know. I'm having a good time. I love short story writing.
When it comes to this Willoughby universe, what would you say is the driving kind of force behind these stories? Because the Twilight Zone often reflected on pointing out things in society and the woes of mankind and kind of the perils that we'd gotten ourselves into with that science fiction horror twist, specifically with the twist. What's the driving force behind these stories that are going on?
Well, kind of different for the Willoughby stuff, because the Willoughby stuff for me, yeah, there's definitely elements of, I like to play around with things like have and have nots, women and men, rural versus urban. Like, I grew up in cities, and the first time I was like in a small town, I felt very uncomfortable. And so I kind of talk about that in there, how there's kind of a otherness that's felt. And so there's lots of those kind of things. But for me, like, number one is always character. That's what I've always, when I sit down to write, it's about the character first. So I like to tell whatever's happening in the story, whatever crazy monster is there, whatever, supernatural or not element is there. For me, it really begins with the character. Like, for instance, Daphne, who is the main character of all three of my novels, she has an anxiety problem, and that's based on something that happened in her past. And so mental health is something I like to talk about. And I like kick-ass final girls, but for me, I really like complicated heroines who, you know, maybe aren't always perfect and they mess up and they make mistakes. And so for me, it's always character first. But yeah, I do, to answer your question, I do explore the same kind of things I think Rod Serling would want to explore now in 2020 world. 2021, I mean.
Well, I like what you said about putting characters first. One of the adages I turn to that I tell people when it comes to writing is that we love a good story, but we fall in love with characters. That seems, it's something that's an oft-repeated mantra of mine whenever I speak with writers, because it tends to hold true the more that I speak with other people. And this thing that I thought maybe just was more applicable to my sensibility turns out to be a lot broader than I could have thought, and I'm glad that it is, because it really does revolve around characters.
Oh, yeah.
Tying that into what you mentioned about Stephen King creating characters as well. I don't know if you'd agree with this, because this is kind of a controversial statement that I'd say, but I often feel like Stephen King might be the most misunderstood popular writer in modern history.
Okay, yeah, I want to hear why.
Because I think the popularity of King has undone the fact that he is a wonderful storyteller based off of the characters that he creates and the situations he puts them into. I think we have kind of a societal belief, at least amongst some of the hardcore horror fans, that if something is popular, it must not be that deep, because often popularity revolves... has to be broad in order to be popular. And the popularity of King and the prevalence of adaptations of his work detract from the fact that his books feature interesting characters when you boil it down, and I think the primary example of that is probably The Shining. How the film just does not do the character of Jack Torrance any justice when it comes to his complexities. But the book goes into extraordinary detail about how complex and loving but delusional this man is becoming. And when I was reading that, it's like, wow, do people actually read Stephen King books these days and realize what's going on? Which is why I really enjoyed reading through the science of Stephen King, because you did dive hard into these books, even though it was a look at some of the elements of the horror in them, as opposed to a deep character analysis or story analysis.
It's funny because, well, I had somebody say to me once, they're like, "Oh, I heard somebody call you the next Stephen King," and I said, "Oh my gosh, well, thanks." And she said, "Well, I hope you're not, because I don't like Stephen King." And it was like kind of this backhanded compliment. And I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "Well, what books have you read?" She said, "Well, I haven't read any of his books." And it kind of made me chuckle to myself, because she was literally basing it on movies. I think a lot of people now base their opinion on Stephen King on the films, that's for sure. So that's kind of funny. And then there's this idea that because, first of all, he writes horror, and second of all, he sells way more copies than anyone else will ever, that it's not good. And another incident I had, I was in college, I was up in one of those higher echelon literature classes, a romanticism class, and somebody before class was just tearing into Stephen King, how terrible a writer he is, and everybody was agreeing. And of course, I grew up just absolutely idolizing him. I was too timid at the time to say my opinion, but it stuck in my mind because they all kind of wanted to sacrifice him because of this idea of not only is he writing this content that has horror in it, but because he's not a good writer. But that's not true. He's a really good writer, and he makes, like you said, he has characters that you care about and are complex and that reflect things that he's gone through in his life. And so yeah, I will stand and defend that he's a phenomenal writer. And I think that it's unfortunate that some people let sort of movies or concepts of who they think he is get in the way. Because I think if anybody picks up a Stephen King book, and not everyone is perfection, but most of them, they're going to be blown away. So
one of the things I found interesting was when I first picked up a copy of Carrie, compared to the film, which my mother was a big fan of, and I watched, again, far too young for my age. There was so much more in the novel about the framing devices, about putting this in the context of a world where a supernatural psychic event had happened. One person could interpret it as padding, but at the same time, it was really fleshing out this universe to make Carrie and the lives that she affected richer and fuller. There's a lot of iconic women in horror. Where does Carrie fit in with
the overall pantheon of women in horror? And then what female personas, characters, do you feel are vastly underappreciated, either in fiction, in the like actual fictional characters, or producers and directors of horror that are women?
Oh, wow, cool. Okay, first, Carrie. I think that Carrie is such a complicated thing because I think a lot of movies or books, they're made to be pretty easy to figure out who the good guy and who the bad guy are. And I love the complexities of Carrie because, that was the first Stephen King book I read. And I read it right when I was her same age. And so it really resonated with me on many levels. There was a automatic empathy there. And I think a lot of people watch or read the prom scene, and I've seen the meme. It's like, you go girl, go for you. I mean, good for you, because yeah, she she does something that really murdered people, but at the same time there is sort of that revenge, and revenge is obviously something that you've seen a lot in female-led horror movies. And so it's tough because they try to make her out to be a monster there at the end, but she was created, she's Frankenstein's monster. She was created to have that happen to her. And she has this mom who's more monstrous than anything that she does. So I think you could debate for an hour or more about who's the bad guy and who's not in that movie. But I think a lot of people, not just women, have empathy with her and remember how much high school sucked. And then, underappreciated characters. I agree with you that in The Shining, in the film, that Jack doesn't show his complexities that are in the book as much because Jack Nicholson kind of is Jack Nicholson.
Yes. I
feel this need to defend Shelley Duvall's Wendy because I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's because I'm a mom. I feel almost this like maternal feeling of like, you give her a break. Like everybody likes to, I've seen a lot of mean comments about her, whether it be her acting in the film or her character doesn't, she's not strong enough, or she doesn't take things in her own hands quick enough or whatever. But I think she's kind of a forgotten final girl because she uses her smarts to get Danny out of that window. She's trying to deal with, this abusive husband who we kind of learn, didn't just start being abusive there in the hotel and all these things. So, and I saw a meme where it was like, oh, this is how you hold a bat. And it was a picture of Negan. And it's like, this is somebody who doesn't know how to hold a bat. And it was her. It's easy to look at somebody like I've used the example Ripley now a couple times, but it's easy to look at Ripley and be like, yeah, badass. But we're also attributing badass to her masculine traits. There's nothing wrong with being maternal or all those other kinds of aspects and being a final girl. You don't have to kick ass. You don't have to have muscles because, then aren't we just taking that final girl and kind of turning her into a man? I don't know. I think there are so many final girls like that don't get cred. Oh my gosh. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of Jennifer's Body is a great movie that I think was underrated, and Karen Kusama. There's so many. I don't even know where to begin.
Well, Jennifer's Body is an interesting one to bring up because that's a perfect example of how, from the surface level when it was coming out, I think there was this problem with labeling Megan Fox as a sex symbol and then seeing the casting of her as basically stunt casting because she was the hot it girl at the time, thanks to Transformers, where she was being just entirely exploited for her appearance. In Jennifer's Body, the sexuality of it was weaponized in a kind of interesting fashion to show kind of the weakness of men, just how powerful sexuality can be when employed and used as a powerful tool, I guess you could say.
I think weaponized is the perfect word. And you're right. She was sexualized so much. And you're right. She was the it girl. And it was like, oh, Megan Fox, like she's just, the hottest woman alive and everything. And so it's almost perfect casting, but it's got in the way. And, honestly, I think if that movie came out now, it had much better legs on it than it did then. Even if it was the exact same movie, made the exact same way, I think that people would understand the concept a little bit better now. I think people are a lot more open to sort of promising young woman aspects of feminism and horror. And there's a tongue-in-cheek, obviously, to Jennifer's Body that I think it was just ahead of its time.
You think of any others that, if they were released today, may have been better received?
I'll say it. I think that even though it was only a couple of years old, I think that the female Ghostbusters would probably go better this time. I'm not saying it's a perfect movie, but I think it certainly was soured. And I don't know, maybe I'm naive in thinking that people are any more forward thinking than they were 4 years ago or whenever it came out. I'd like to think that we're in a little bit better spot than we were then. And Kelly, my co-author, and we have a podcast called Horror Rewind, and we talk about movies that we watched back in the day, and we both love Ghostbusters, so we rewatched it to kind of familiarize ourselves with it again and talk about it kind of from now a more feminist perspective. And we were both really disappointed because it's a fun movie, it's a great movie, but females don't fare great in it. I think there was some room for the female Ghostbusters, but I know a lot of people did not agree with that. But I think, unfortunately, it was like dead before it even got started. So
when it comes to like a female style reboot like that, do you feel it's better to, because there's two ways you could have approached it. I think this is where the dividing line with that Ghostbusters reboot was, where there were some people who just didn't like the fact that they were rebooting the universe. There are some people who hated it in general because of their idiotic prejudices against women supposedly taking jobs away from men or whatever bullshit reason. But then there's another division of people who I tend to fall more into, where I think the movie would have been better if it had been set in the same universe.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't have had to compare their starring roles of this cast to the Venkman, the Egon, those people. If it had been set in the same universe, but with new people taking up the torch, do you think that would have been better?
Oh, yeah. I think if it had been like, oh, it's their daughters even, or just these women are going to restart the crumbling building where Ghostbusters was. Yeah, like I do think that would have been better. And I mean, I think there are a lot of choices that could have been made to make it better. But at the same time, like, seeing little girls dressed up as Ghostbusters was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And, from a female perspective, again, it's like, hey, we'll take what we can get to.
I have a young niece who's 3.5 years old. Some of the first little toys that I got her were Pokemon, Mario Brothers, and Mega Man, specifically targeting video game characters that were not just female-based, because I wanted her to realize that it's okay to play games that are generally considered games for guys, I guess you could say, or for young boys growing up.
Yes.
I'll be darned if she doesn't turn 5 years old, goes to kindergarten, and can beat the asses of any guy at a Switch game. I guarantee it.
That's right. Go, girl.
Yeah, I want her to have that.
No, that's good. I mean, it's kids these days, they're not going to be separated and segregated so much as we were and told what we were supposed to like. That's for sure.
Yeah, because that kind of stuff leaves an impression on people. It's hard for some men to call themselves feminists because there's a lot of people who will co-opt that, or a lot of men who will co-opt that to feel like they're speaking out of turn. A lot of them do. Where, you can be a feminist, but you shouldn't put yourself out there to replace the voice of women who are actually going through things like sexism and the wage gap and harassment and all those things. But there are a lot of feminist ideals that have sunk into me thanks to some very positive influences in my life. But even then, because of the era that I was raised in, there's times where I will instantly think to myself, like if I see a female sportscaster, there's a part of my there's a part of my subconscious that thinks that she doesn't know as much about sports as a man does because of how I was raised. And I have to consciously fight back against that. No, that's a ridiculous, ignorant thought, but it's still there because of the impact that those forces have on us when we're growing up.
Yeah, and I think people, and I'm kind of throwing you in, assuming you're around my age, but I think people that are my age, what am I, 37?
Yeah, we're about the same age. I was born in 85.
Okay, yep. So it's like, I think we are kind of going through that thing where we have those voices in our head of our parents or media that we grew up with. And we'll hear it, and then we go, okay, that's stupid. Like you said, you realize, like, okay, that's really stupid that I thought that. But it's like our parents, it's so inculcated in them that they can't even, a lot of times I don't think they can even see the how silly it is to have that thought. But I love that, our kids, boys are 13 and 9, and I love that they, for instance, my 13-year-old, like his favorite color is pink, and he chose pink braces. And he wears pink, and it never occurred to him not to. And I love that because it's like in my, my husband and I were saying like in our school, like you would have got your, butt kicked. So it's kind of nice to see, and you see it in horror. It's like things are opening up and people are realizing, not only men and women, but we're realizing how cool it is to have movies from, people with different racial backgrounds, different, life experiences and everything. And I mean, think of just like, I don't know if you saw the movie His House. It's an amazing horror movie, and it's a movie that wouldn't have been made. It's about African refugees, and it's so good and it's so scary. And I love that the world of horror is just expanding, and we're getting to sort of see horror from all these new areas of thought.
So when it comes to, considering how horror has expanded, when it comes to the films of the past, which can sometimes be dotted with racism and sexism, how would you advise people, considering how our culture is kind of evolving, to recognize things of the past that were less than savory, I guess is a gentle way to put it? How do you advise for people to go back and view those films? Because there's a contingent that would say that these films should kind of be ignored and not so readily available, and there are others that are saying they should be viewed under the context of how they were made. But there's still some classic horror films out there that might be sexist and racist in comparison today, but there's merit to how they've influenced the genre. How do you approach films like that and under the microscope of today?
I'm not a big fan of this idea of like, okay, well, let's just take that horror movie and like bury it under the dirt and never talk about it again. Because I think, again, maybe this is my Pollyanna view of the world, but I'd like to think that people are good and people are smart, and that they can view something and understand that it was something that was culturally acceptable at the time and isn't anymore. I think that's something that is completely valid, and that people need to be able to experience, whether it's film or literature or music. I think that we as a society can become better by learning some of those things. And also, taking a movie and, something we talk about in Horror Rewind and in our books too is like, oftentimes horror is a very nostalgic experience. It's okay to like a movie that you liked because it opened a whole new world to you when you were 8 or 10 or 13 or 20. It's okay to go back and watch it and go, oh wow, that's really sexist or that's really racist right there. But it's still okay to like the movie. That's kind of something that we've, sort of learned. And that's, of course, my opinion. But I think as long as you are willing to ask questions of, yourself and of what's going on in the movie or book or whatever, and you're willing to go, okay, that was okay then, that's not okay now, which I think most adults, maybe kids, not so much, but I think most adults can watch things and experience it that way and still appreciate parts of it, knowing that there are problematic other parts.
So if you had to pick 3 pieces of horror media, whether they be books, comics, games, music, movies, that you feel are deserving of more attention today, that people aren't talking about enough, whether they be something new that's recently came out, something old, what are 3 pieces of horror media that you feel deserve more attention right now?
Oh, good question. I was talking about Shirley Jackson, and some people feel like, oh, Shirley Jackson gets talked about a lot because there aren't enough famous female horror writers. But actually, when it comes down to it and you talk to people, it seems like a lot of horror fans still haven't read a lot of Shirley Jackson, especially like, Haunting of Hill House, for instance, is one of her books that is, probably is definitely the most popular. But she has some work, We've Always Lived in the Castle, Hangs a Man, The Bird's Nest, that are horror, subtle horror, but they definitely need a lot of attention.
I have a fun little Shirley Jackson anecdote when it comes to that.
Oh, yeah?
I used to work in a family-owned hotel that was on its last legs. It eventually closed down while I was there. They had a very old boiler system. Now, shining comparisons aside.
Oh boy. Yeah.
But the manager would make jokes about how he had to go down there and sacrifice a chicken every winter to make sure that the heater would come on, and then do the same thing again in the summer to make sure that the air conditioning would kick on. And he'd come up to me and say, I don't think these chickens are cutting anymore. We're going to have to sacrifice something bigger. And I said, Frank, I got an idea for you. I'll put out a personal ad saying, wanted, one person to visit a hotel who has not read Shirley Jackson's The Lottery.
Well, how'd it go?
I never put the ad in. Something about that rubbed Frank the wrong way. He didn't want to go that route. Though, in fairness, Frank did say at some point in time, because he's a classic film buff, he said that at some point in time for Halloween, we should have changed the breakfast menu to, instead of reading like eggs and greens, to eggs and Soylent Greens, to see if anybody would pick up on it.
Nice. See somebody drop their fork.
Yeah, that would have been great.
Okay, and then my other thing that I would ask people to do, because I know I'm guilty of this, realizing that you're just reading books by white men, that's something that I like, and I hate. A lot of my favorite authors are white men, like Stephen King, Joe Hill, Keelan Patrick Burke is a new horror author I love. There are so many underappreciated women and people of color horror writers. Thankfully, books like Mexican Gothic are coming on the scene and stuff like that. But I would just say that, I'm not going to pick any one particular, but there's so many. And maybe just look at your reading stack and see who you're reading. And then my third underappreciated, I don't know if it's really underappreciated, but Ash vs. Evil Dead is like the best horror show ever. And I just want 10,000 more seasons. So yeah, I'll say that.
That is the sad thing about anything that came out on the Starz network, is that they never had the funding to continue it past like 2 or 3 seasons.
Yeah. I love that show.
It applied to like everything that they did. They just
really?
They had great things that just didn't have the financial backing, so they ended up scrapping things. And same thing with Ash vs. Evil Dead. Just didn't get the numbers because Starz doesn't have the number of subscribers. Now, you do have coming up as well, you have the Science of Serial Killers coming out later this year, correct?
Yes, that's coming out in October, and that, we're kind of doing our same thing with that we do with our other books, is we kind of infuse both science, Hollywood, and serial killers. So it was quite a dance of 3 very disparate things.
Well, when it comes to serial killers and the true crime genre, which if there's any element of quote-unquote horror that has blown up, it feels like it's true crime.
Oh, yeah.
When it comes to talking about true crime, though, where should we be drawing the line on how much of this is attracting people to the killers and how much of it is coming at the expense of the people who were victimized by these killers?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was, of all our books we've done, this is the one where Kelly and I had the most preparation conversations, because it was very important to us. If you take a book that we wrote called Science of Monsters, we're very much pumping up these iconic villains, and we were attacking, Freddy and Jason, all them. And we really wanted to make sure that this book about serial killers was basically the opposite, where we were taking their pedestals and throwing them away, because we did not want anyone to read a chapter out of that book and be like, wow, Ted Bundy's awesome. Or, wow, I wish I had been around when Jack the Ripper was around. We really did not want to add to the mythos of these people, because they're just bad guys. They're just pieces of shit. I mean, yeah, there's interesting science and psychology, and we go into all that. But like Kelly said, at the end of every chapter, she felt like saying, in conclusion, this guy was an asshole, because that would have worked for every chapter. But, what we really did is we interviewed people on the other side of things. We interview and talk about victimhood. We actually got, my favorite interview was a FBI agent who helped catch Jeffrey Dahmer. And so we got his perspective as, somebody in that vein, which was really cool. And so we really try to focus on the science, the media, the victims, and we really try not to put these guys and women on pedestals. That was our big hope with this book. So hopefully we achieve that. It is a very shaky line there, that true crime is interesting, but how do you not make these guys seem bigger than life.
Well, to start to wrap things up here, I want to hit a couple points fast on your book so that we can, push a little bit of them into people's minds. We've already talked about the science serial killers. You've got a great interview that you said that you have lined up with one of the FBI agents who was tracking down Dahmer. So that sounds like it's going to be fascinating. What would be your favorite section of the science of monsters in horror? What would your favorite part of that book that people should look for?
My favorite part of that book, again, it's kind of going into true crime. I became fascinated with Ed Gein when I was little.
Oh boy.
And I know, it says a lot. In fact, I tell this story a lot in presentations, but I was going to go babysit one day, and I had this Ed Gein book with all the, it had pictures. It was awful. And I was like, going out the door, I was going to babysit a baby, so I wanted to bring a book to read. And my mom's like, maybe don't bring that book babysitting. And she was right. I look back on it now, I was really mad at her because she gave me some boring book to read, but she was probably right. But anyway, I go into psychology and the science of monsters and talk about, Leatherface, Norman Bates, and Buffalo Bill are all based on Ed Gein. And so we kind of go into the interesting psychology, and I interviewed a psychiatrist at the Mayo Clinic and talked to him about dissociative identity disorder, which I always thought was interesting. So that's probably my favorite topic in there. For science of women in horror,
yes.
We had so much fun writing that book. We called it our feminist manifesto. We had too much fun. We interviewed, lots of amazing women, including Dee Wallace and people like that. Honestly, I think my favorite study that I worked on and researched for that book is something called the Scully effect. I'm a huge X-Files fan. And the Scully effect is about representation in media and how it's literally proven in numbers that by having Scully on prime time as a scientist actually did affect how many women went into science at that time period. So it's a really cool study to just realize that it's that important to have people on TV and movies and all that look like us.
And for people who want to dive into your fiction, actually, before I say that, I do want to back up everything that you just said about the power of representation and how vitally important that is, because most of the people who complain about diverse representation are people who have been represented in media their entire lives. You'll never, whether it's myself or my friends who are white males, will never understand what it's like to not be represented in media. So when it comes to that discussion, you gotta keep your freaking mouth shut, because it's...
I so agree. I agree. It's just something that, you guys just haven't experienced. And it's something that, I think so important. I just love seeing these scientific numbers that back it up.
And it's not like the lack of representation for white men hurts. I can watch the Golden Girls and be perfectly fine laughing my ass off.
That's right. And and again, I can watch Ghostbusters and have a good time too. But, I think it's time.
When it comes to Scully, perfect example of a smart, intelligent, critical thinking woman who there was not a lot of in media at the time, and it's sad that there wasn't.
I know, isn't it? We've come a long way, baby. I really do believe that. I'm a positive person, but I think we've come a long way. We have a lot further to go. But yeah.
Well, then when it comes to one more element of females in horror, and obviously you're doing your fictional writing, where would you recommend people start off to dive into your world that you've created?
Sure. So if you like short stories, if that's kind of your jam and you kind of just want to jump around, I would suggest reading my Twisted Reverie series. And if you want to really immerse yourself in rural Gothic murder plus supernatural female-driven axe murder, come on over to Her Dark Inheritance. That's my first novel, and then there's 2 novels after that. I also, Twisted Reveries, I have another book of that coming out in October, as well as hopefully by the end of the year, my 4th novel, which is not related to the other 3. It's at this point a standalone. So I have a lot. And I love writing, clearly. I love that this is my job and I get to write and have people read my stuff. It's pretty fun.
Where's the best place people can go to pick up a copy of any of your any of your creations?
You can find me on Twitter at Meg Hafdahl, and I'm sometimes selling signed copies of my books, but, Amazon, of course, support your local bookshops, especially our science of books are a little more easy to find, but basically you can find them anywhere books are sold. And my fiction, is pretty easy to find too. You can also go to meghafdahl.com.
Actually, there's one more thing I got to bring up because this is
Yes.
this could be a sticking point. Because you mentioned Ghostbusters. What are your thoughts on Ghostbusters 2?
Here's the thing. I'm going to be honest with you. I love Ghostbusters 2.
Oh, thank God. Thank you.
I would even argue it's better. The painting is so scary.
I know, isn't it? There's a real tangible threat in the movie. Like in the first one, they never feel like they're in danger, but in the second one, they're almost burned alive. They almost drown.
I know. No, I'm like a big proponent of Ghostbusters too. No, that one it stands out for my childhood even more than the original. So
thank you. And Peter McNichol is a freaking national treasure.
He's so creepy. I've never seen him since then without just like feeling a creep up my spine.
I know. It's like anytime I go to watch Ally McBeal, and it's like, hey, Yano, shh.
Yeah,
what are you doing here?
That's who he'll always be to me.
There's just some great lines in there. It's like, hey, that was my second favorite show. Oh, really? What's your other one? Bassmasters. Bass? Yeah, I know Bassmasters.
Remember that. Yes.
That's a good note to end on. I'm glad I got another component for Ghostbusters 2. Thank you, Meg.
Yes. Woohoo!
Anyway, again, thank you, Meg Hafdahl, writer extraordinaire of the Science of series and also her own fictional series. You can find the Willoughby Chronicles and some of her short stories anthologies on the sites that she mentioned. And what's the Twitter address again?
Just at Meg Hafdahl.
So thank you very much for joining me for this hour.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. I'll talk horror with you anytime.
Oh, it'd be great. And if we can ever find the time to rope Kelly into here too, I'd love to talk with you both about everything that you've been working on.
Yeah, that would be fun. It gets crazy when it's both of us.
I can imagine. But thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to stop by.
Oh, thanks so much.
And for myself to all of you out there, this is the Critical Android thanking you for tuning in to the Crypt of the Unknown. There's much more to come in future episodes, but for now, the Crypt is closed.